gather you had some difficulty getting here this morning.
I'm afraid so. I don't live in London anymore, and it was a touch and go. But
well, thank you for making
fortunately, more touch than go in the end.
Well, thank you for making the effort to be here in time for the start, if I may say so. Thank you.
Thank you. It's clear, or at least I ought to make it clear, that I represent obviously more than one firm. I'm here representing Birnberg, Peirce, a second firm, Saunders Law, and a third, Hanover Bond Law. Altogether, they constitute 24 different families and 44 different individuals, including children. If I may, we've made a sincere effort and a detailed effort on behalf of the bereaved and the survivors and the residents. All of those, that's the solicitors and the barristers, have been cooperating over the last few months, in fact, to ensure that the breadth of representation in terms of spoken and as well as written representations are made in a coordinated way so that they dovetail and therefore reflect what the desires are of the people we represent. And you will see from the list that was sent to you in advance the considerable achievement that has been made with that regard. And may I assure you that that endeavour will continue so that you have no fears that you'll be facing a phalanx of the same arguments. That's just not going to be the case. But there will be some overlap. And may I just follow on from Mr. Friedman's emphasis on the Human Rights Act by not repeating that, but by coming perhaps to a focal point today. I think everyone in the room recognizes that there's a watershed opportunity here today with you to make a real difference to what is perceived to be, unfortunately, a process which has become disengaged. In many respects, it's no individual's fault, but it often happens that things fall by the wayside unless it's grasped at an initial stage. Mr. Friedman just touched on it, but one recognizes that the first stage at which public confidence was shaken was actually the fire itself. Because it's a national, I've used the word before, it's a national atrocity. And in that sense, one asks the rhetorical and vernacular question, how on earth in the 21st century, in one of the richest boroughs in the United Kingdom, can a block like this just go up in flames with so many casualties involved? I don't mean those, I do, of course, include those who died in the block, but the casualties are far greater than that. That is the people who live around the immediate vicinity, but far greater than that, because everyone who lives in a tower block will have been affected by that. In fact, everybody has a collective responsibility, and that is the way in which, in a sense, the system was shaken at that point. Everybody said to themselves, well, it can happen to them, it can happen to me. And therefore, the need to, excuse my voice, to generate and regenerate trust began the moment the fire took place. But there is a slight reflection backwards, which I mention at this stage, is that, and I know it's in the list of issues, but this had been predicted, or at least the danger of fire had been predicted. So it's even before the fire, people who lived in the block, and it's a very, you've heard, diverse community in its own right. Some of them, that's very kind of you, thank you. As long as you don't tip it over me, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed. People in the block, as well as neighbouring blocks, had actually made warnings, given warnings of this kind of thing. And I just want to quote what the Prime Minister said when that these matters had just happened and were fresh in everybody's mind. And these are important words said by the Prime Minister at that time, 22nd of June, to the House of Commons. And it's this essence of confidence that needs to be regenerated. She said this: for too long, residents have been overlooked and ignored. So it's not just the residents saying it, it's not just the bereaved saying it. Here you have the Prime Minister saying it. We will ensure they are involved in every step of this process. No stone will be left unturned in this inquiry. Now we move from the fire, from a community that had been ignored, to what was going to happen thereafter. Well, what has happened thereafter, to some extent, has not restored the confidence, whether it is by oversight or any other reason. There is a distinct feeling today that they have not, that is, those people most effective, have not been included, so that the restoration of public confidence generally and the restoration of confidence by those most affected, as claimed by the Prime Minister, are yet to be fully engaged. Now, some of the points have already been made. I don't repeat those, but I want to concentrate on one of the ways in which that trust, the integrity of the process being, as it were, put back in the centre along with the bereaved, is in fact to look at the decision-making process that has been going on. And we say that the decision-making process cannot be left to one person. It should be reflective of the community and, to some extent, the public at large, for there to be, at the end of the day, confidence in the findings. You yourself cannot be expected to reflect the diversity in one person. No one person on earth could do that. And the way that the families will, as it were, be encouraged to respond and engage is if they see, alongside yourself, we've called it a panel. May I just say there's been considerable confusion in the public domain between panel members and assessors. And that continues to this day. They're obviously different. I spell it out so that it's clear what we're asking for at this stage. Now, we appreciate that you're not in a position to appoint panel members. But what we are asking is that if at this juncture, and it's not a matter that I've raised today for the first time, as you well know, I did write along these lines many, many months ago, that the Prime Minister, who's also being addressed by these submissions, we've sent the same points to her, and she said in September to the House of Commons that the matter was then, in September, under review, were the words she used. And so we hope, genuinely hope, that it is still under review. And if it is, that you have today the support of the families to, as it were, ask the Prime Minister, maybe you can't go much beyond a request, that in fact she consider as soon as possible, and now there is a different time frame to the one that existed before, there is now time for you to be accompanied by, one's looking at figures here, it's got to be an odd number, otherwise it's very difficult to take decisions. So we would submit either another 2 or another 4, have experience of the Macpherson inquiry, where in fact there were 4 others, so it had a total of 5. It was much easier, one understands, to take decisions in those circumstances. And that would then begin to satisfy some of the problems that are perceived by the families that exist at the moment. Now, and obviously, if one of the additional panel members could have an expertise or a reflection of the community, some families would like to have make some contribution to that. And that's, of course, in other words, make suggestions as to who the panel member might be. But I'm not going to, as you've read all the paperwork, I'm not going to do very much more than just a brief reference to a report that Birnberg Peirce had commissioned. I think you've seen it, Dr. Marie Stewart's report.
Yes, I did have that, and I did read it, yes.
Yes, I'll just refer to 2 paragraphs, that's all, so that perhaps when you have a moment to reread them. It's paragraph 7 in section B of the report, and particularly paragraph 8, where she talks about the diversity of the tower and the different backgrounds and the sort of issues that will be raised in relation to this inquiry beyond the technical, but dealing with their own experiences, are all spelt out there. I'm not going to read it out, it's all there for you to see. And paragraphs 12 and 13. Perhaps 13 is the initial sentence of 13 is important. This inquiry will be required to take account of human factors, same point that's been made before, where diversity is central to the matters under investigation. Particularly relevant will be issues 7, governance, 8, communication, and just to give an illustration how you communicate the fire safety measures to the people who are there when you have a diverse community, what warnings were given and what was the reception of their communications about their difficulties. And 9, fire advice, of course, same point. 12, response of the emergency services, and 13, the aftermath. The aftermath, just pausing for a moment, is a matter that is easily spoken, aftermath, but of course it's massive here. And one of the big questions will be whether there were contingency plans, and if they weren't, why weren't they in place to deal with something like this? Perhaps the biggest contingency that's been overlooked, or at least marginalised, it hasn't had centre stage until the last 2 months when eventually it surfaced, and that's mental health in relation to. It's not just therefore people who died, but the ones who continue to be suffering under the stress and trauma of what has happened. So, and therefore, there are other comparisons made with, which I don't go through, the Macpherson-Lawrence inquiry, in which the benefits of having more than one person helping to decide the various facets. And of course, Macpherson was dealing with a very wide range of issues, just as we are here. So I pause for a moment. That's the issue we would ask that perhaps you make a recommendation after today in relation to that particularly important aspect.
Before you leave that, can you just help me on one thing? I think you recognise that whether to appoint other people to a panel is for the Prime Minister.
Yes, it is.
Do you think it would be of any value if the inquiry were to try to put together a consultative panel of local people, and not decision-making panel, but a panel who could talk to the inquiry and receive information from the inquiry and become, to that extent, more involved? Would that be helpful?
It would be helpful. May I just say, I think that that is a concept that's been employed in the child abuse inquiry and has proved to be successful with the meeting of the group, the individuals concerned, as well as experts, as well as lawyers. So it's a multifaceted situation in which the panel represents in that way. But I think the core point we make is whether you have more assessors, more experts, or a consultative panel, at the end of the day, who is taking the decision? That is the key point. Yeah. Because, of course, the decision maker would be quite entitled to say, in their discretion, if there's more than one, we don't accept the advice, we don't accept that, or we accept something else. So they're the decision makers. That's what matters to the families, that the decision makers they have confidence in will reflect the sort of matters that Dr. Stewart refers to in her report. So it would help, but I'm afraid it doesn't quite solve it.
All right. Thank you very much.
I'm keeping an eye on the clock. Perhaps somebody I didn't notice when I how much longer I've got. But anyway,
I think you've got a little while, because
good.
Those ahead of you have been quite economical.
Yes. Is that? I wonder if that's a hint. I'll keep it short as I can. May I pass to a second area, which is on the list, and has been referred to in passing by Mr. Friedman, namely the division or structure in which the inquiry is seeking to go ahead. And the word robust has been used. I'm going to apply it to what I have to say in relation to this, because our submission is that you revisit this whole issue. I don't know when it was first envisaged, but whenever it was a much earlier stage, and it was understandable at the beginning, because everybody was saying, let's have a quick answer to this so we can do something about it, putting it again shortly. And if you just reflect on what's happened in the past, a number of the people sitting here today, along with myself, were involved in Hillsborough. Now, what happened there is of interest, because 96 people, so it's not substantially different, a very complicated situation, and so forth. But the Taylor inquiry, which I'm sure you're familiar with, got off the ground very quickly indeed, in fact, within a month or so of the disaster that happened there on the terraces in April. Within 2 months, it was off the ground. The importance of it, and I'm only going to emphasize this one aspect, was that the inquiry were conscious of the fact that if they were going to make a difference, they'd have to report back to make changes to prevent further deaths, which is the matter that's come up in many people's submissions, and today already orally. If you're going to prevent further deaths, you don't wait until October next year, which is a new timetable, because you will remember you yourself thought it would be possible to get a report by Easter. So that's shifted. Again, no criticism of that. It's obvious that there's a lot to be considered. However, my point is that all of this contributes, unlike Hillsborough, where there were massive changes made to football grounds for the start of the season, all-seater stadiums and so on. I don't need to go through what happened. That time has passed. And in fact, I don't want to be glib about the causes of the fire, but many of the families say, well, wait a minute, it's all on film. We can see what happened. Well, they can see an oversight of what happened. And it's not the detail, obviously, but there is as it were, an understanding that the fire may have come from a particular item, may have spread very fast through the cladding and so on. So that isn't the big question. It's the big question that I put at the beginning, namely the public are saying, how could this have happened in this day and age to that extent? So it's that question. And of course, many local authorities have already addressed the causes. 82 tower blocks within about a month. By the middle of July last year, 82 tower blocks in this country with similar cladding failed the current fire safety tests. So, if I can put it again in the vernacular, people are onto this already. And therefore, the need for you is still there to examine the precise causes, but actually not any longer to do what the Taylor report had to do. Therefore, we take a step back and say, what is, well, it's Mr. Friedman's question, what's the purpose of the inquiry? And if it is, in fact, what the families want is an identification of responsibility for the matters that went wrong here. And no one's doubting that things did go badly wrong. So they want accountability. That's all part of the human rights aspect of this. How are they best going to begin that process? In other words, I'm coming back to the overarching need for public confidence and families' confidence. Not only would that be reinstated by the panel, it would also be reinstated if they felt the question they most want answered is going to be addressed sooner rather than later. Now, I pause again. There is an unspoken fear, well, sometimes articulated fear, that were you to, as it were, enter this arena, you would in some way, or the inquiry would be in some way, jeopardising the police inquiry that Mr. Johnson's spoken about. We are all conscious of that, the families included, that nobody wants to jeopardise what the police are doing. However, there is, as it were, a well-trodden path here. It's happened before. I can give you the illustrations whereby the police, in parallel with an inquiry and or an inquest, has taken place because of the undertakings that are given and because the inquest, no more than an inquiry, has the power to identify individuals and say somebody's guilty. That's not the function of either of them. So therefore, to that extent, that's not the conclusions that overlap. One understands, meanwhile, that evidential bases that are being looked at could overlap. However, it was successfully overcome recently in Hillsborough. There was a police inquiry going on at the very same time and feeding into the, I appreciate it's an inquest, not an inquiry, although Mr. Friedman's point about you're performing the role of an inquest anyway, or that's the suggestion. So we say that position has been countenanced and overcome. But that's not the only one. Zeebrugge, going back many years. The rail inquiries, going back Clapham, King's Cross, and so on, they all happened at the same time. So it's entirely possible for it to happen. So we say, as a sort of policy issue, you and any other panel members, if there are any appointed, can, as it were, revisit this on that basis, that there won't be jeopardy, provided everybody acts responsibly. And there's no suggestion here that those core participants are going to act irresponsibly. And there's been plenty of time for any irresponsibility to be shown, and it hasn't been. Quite the opposite. So may I move from the policy issue to why we say in practice, practical terms, it's artificial division and not seriously workable. So that if I just look at, if I may, section B of your council statement, where at paragraph 20 he sets out the issues, and you'll be very familiar with them, for phase one. The first one is an extremely important one, the existing fire safety and prevention measures at Grenfell Tower, period. Now, we say, as an example, that others have given the evacuation and, in a sense, splicing and dicing these issues so that you don't deal with the stay-put strategy. Well, here on 5A is an extremely important, as it were, area. And we say it can't possibly be that witnesses, whether they're experts or whether they're members of the groups that we represent, the deceased and the bereaved and survivors and residents, is it to be said that they come to the witness box and they can only speak to their experiences on the night? So I'm dealing with it from the point of view of the families in particular. It's artificial and unreal because we say that, and I can give you many illustrations from the families themselves already. They haven't all put it into words yet, but they can do. Namely, and I can just say it, as it were, from the experience of speaking to them, they all, the ones particularly who lived there, and who've lived there in one case for 30 years, that 30-year experience means that when this particular individual comes into this witness box, wherever it happens to be at that time, he can only speak as to what the effect was on his floor and so on, but he can't speak about the fact that, for example, he will say, there have been fires there in Grenfell Tower before. but they've been contained. Why were they contained and this one wasn't? And of course, when it gets into the detail, each and every family are saying fire hoses, sprinklers, fire doors, access for fire engines, car park out of use. They all were there. And it will be unreal for them to have some cut-off point at which you can't speak about that today, very sorry, come back again. Well, they won't want to do that. Now, if you're not going to, quite rightly, expect them, given the trauma, to come back twice, it means that some of those, and it's nearly all of them, have got much more to say. Sorry, yes, Paul.
I was going to say, you may recall that our initial view on this was that not only that people should come and give evidence once only, for the very reason you've indicated, but they should give all their evidence once only at the beginning.
Yeah.
But we were then told by many of those who represent them that they didn't want to do that. And it was for that reason that we changed our view and said, well, if you don't want to do it all at the beginning, you can do the beginning at the beginning and the rest later on. So we're really trying to be as accommodating as possible and as flexible as possible. Yes,
that is appreciated. The points that we're trying to make now is that it's all moved on considerably from when they were first asked about things. And when they were first asked, I mean, I don't underestimate the trauma because, as you know, one's having considerable contact and experience. The trauma's still there. There's still people without homes to go to. There's still people without support. There's still people suffering on a daily basis. So the trauma's still there. But at the very beginning, when the most they could do was try and get up each day, to be asked to come and be first on in an inquiry that was thought to be happening very soon was too much. That's changed because now, I think from the latest prognosis is that perhaps the statement taking might happen quite soon, but the giving of evidence certainly not, because the precondition that they're all asking for, it's already been touched on, Mr. Weatherby is going to come to it after I finish, namely disclosure. But the key to this is, for all of them, is ensuring that you and the panel, if there is one, get to see everything, and that is disclosed. There is transparency. A lot is said in sympathy of transparency, but at the end of the day, if we, as it were, are not able to see what the miscreants in this particular instance have in their possession, hopefully still, or in the possession of the police, and that's one of the key aspects to this, that they see that. At the time that they're giving evidence, they know that the exercise of retrieving what is necessary for, as it were, assessing and identifying culpability and accountability, then it gives them another element of confidence in what is going on. So it's a circular situation in which you come back to the same issue. So that 5A, which was the one I was just, has got a whole number of, if you look at the main issues from which it comes, 20 paragraph A was the existing fire safety. Well, that's taken from 5A in the original list of issues. There's no contention about the list of issues except one matter I'll mention in a moment. And if you look at 5A and you go down the rest of the page on which it's cited, B, C, D, they're extremely important questions which the families recognise because they're asking what at the moment are not going to come up. In other words, you know, were they effective measures? Did they fail? And if they failed, who failed them? Now, it may not necessarily always be a case of identifying individuals at the beginning. It may be a case of identifying the authority responsible for this, and then you whittle it down at a later stage. So I needn't perhaps go through further illustrations of why we say it's an artificial division, and it will be for the witnesses, experts, as well as the individual families, a much more sensible situation that they give it all at once, which they were not able to do at the beginning, but may I assure you, many of them are now more than willing to, as it were, contribute to the picture of failure because they were on the, as it were, the cutting edge of what went wrong. Now, there is I trespass slightly into another area, but it fits here. Your council went through the various experts, and that's very helpful. But there's one or two areas, well, there's more than one or two, but I just emphasize one area that is missing. And one only begins to touch on it when one begins to see the families, speak to the families, and they say, and they talk about the environment. Now, environmental consequences are important. There's no, as far as I can see on the expert, there's no one who is actually dealing with that area, environmental damage. Now, the environmental damage here is not just obviously the block of flats itself, but the people who manage to get out. And in many cases, many of the ones on the higher floors weren't necessarily burnt to death, although they may in the beginning have died from other causes. And the biggest other cause is smoke in this case, and the distribution of smoke. And of course, the families again have got very strong views on what can be done in tower blocks to ensure that smoke is dispersed at an early stage and isn't in the communal areas. But it's not just smoke, because it's smoke that is toxic. Now, toxicity combined with environmental issues is something we would ask you to consider being put specifically on the list for experts or assessors and or a member of the panel with a view to that, because there were reports, and I go carefully because they would have to be verified, reports that a number of people were treated for cyanide poisoning in hospital. So these are impacts which we say have got to be, for the future, considered within any contingency plan. So that by the time you've, as it were, weighed up these two aspects, the policy issue of having it all in one and the practicality of attempting to split this up, and then effectively what it would mean is that people would have to hang on to the results of phase one and the impact of phase one until you get to phase two. Now, on the timetable, I don't want to preempt it, it would appear that phase two wouldn't start much, well, it wouldn't start before the autumn as such, as a phase. It would start after the report into phase one. Final, therefore, it's delayed too much. It's one thing to have delay to prepare, quite another when the delay by then would be far too long in terms of an effective report on the overall question that is the one that everyone wants answered. But it's already been mentioned, I just put as a footnote, doing it this way, as it were, revisiting the issue and deciding that it can all be done as one ongoing matter without jeopardizing anybody else, you could at any point, the panel could at any point just say, as has been said for coroners, you enter, as it were, an interim, not your version of an interim, but an interim. In other words, a few weeks down the line, when you've got enough information to indicate and identify what has really gone wrong, you can put that into the government and suggest that these matters require urgent attention. So that would be a way of, as it were, dealing with that. So unless there are any other questions on that issue, I pass to the last one that I would like to address. And this is the question, and again it has a ramification for the question of confidence, and that is assessors. Because, and I say it on behalf of another group as well, so council who can't be here today, but one of the concerns is that the assessors that you already have may have some experience. I cite one, Joe Montgomery, in relation to areas of urban regeneration and renewal. But what the concern is, whether there's any assessor, this is again going back to tenants and the families, who actually has experience of social housing management. And we say there isn't anybody who is at the moment on the assessor panel who's capable of really dealing with that aspect of it. And so we would ask that consideration is given to appointing somebody who has has that experience and who can advise in relation to that. That will infuse the confidence issue if there is somebody who's got that experience. Now, we appreciate the terms of reference don't go as wide as many wanted in the first place, and that's another aspect of it which has caused concern. But it's very, very difficult when one gets to the division, and certainly phase 2, to not have regard to aspects of social housing as it affected how these people were dealt with before, the people who lived in that area as opposed to any other area, and how questions of safety were addressed and more particularly financed. And these are issues that the families again would like put to the fore in order for answers to be given. So that in summary form, therefore, the matters that I've raised all go to one issue, and at the end of the day, and that is the real desire that the families have to engage. They want to be involved, but they want to be, as it were, feeling and being seen to do that through the measures that we've attempted to put forward constructively.
Thank you very much indeed. Mm.